You're listening to a free audio download from Venue Cymru's International Concert Series. Welcome to the February edition of pre-concert interviews from Venue Cymru. This month, British piano legend John Lill joined the European Union Chamber Orchestra in Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 12. Before the concert, John Lill talked to us about his life at the keyboard. Tonight we'll be lucky enough to hear you play Mozart's 12th piano concerto.
Well, we hope you'll be lucky enough, yes.
Sure we will. How much freedom do you normally have with concert programming?
Well, if it's a concerto, the orchestra normally requests what they want you to play. If it's a piano recital, solo, then you've got much more freedom of choice. But still, you must get feedback from the promoters in case there's some music they don't particularly want to have. And every season I go around with half a dozen different programmes for recitals, and they can take their choice, really. One of the advantages of computing is the fact that you can keep all of your concerts on file. I've done about 5,000 in my career. And what I don't like to do is to repeat the same programme or the same part of a programme in quick succession. If I'm playing at a certain place and I go back, say, 2 years later, it's often been the case before I made a note of these things that some of the pieces will be repeated, which I don't think is a very good idea. Yeah. Keep it fresh is the answer.
Yeah. You've made many recordings over your career. Are there any works that you'd particularly like to do in the future, or artists you'd like to work with that you haven't?
Many, and in fact also including the ones I've already recorded, because you never stand still. Yeah. You're always, well, hopefully you're progressing, and I think the experience of life will invariably change what your performances are like. They should not be self-conscious changes, but it's evolutionary. It will happen inevitably, that your performances will change slightly from decade to decade, from year to year. So when I hear, and I don't often hear my recordings, when I hear an old recording of myself, sometimes out of interest, it's often substantially different, and not necessarily for the same predictable reason. Some things are freer, some things are less free, some things are faster, some things are slower. It's just the way it has to be at the time. When you're giving a concert, there should be no question that this is the way it has to be. Your public has to be convinced. If you're not convinced by what you're playing, there's no way the public can be.
Yeah.
The main thing is to keep it really a fresh experience, and if I'm playing a work like Beethoven's Emperor Concerto, which I've done a lot of times, then okay, I give it a medical checkup, but then I will learn something else. So you've got to be in good form, but you mustn't hack the work to death so that it becomes really stale. Yeah. Nothing worse. That said, again, I'm not a great fan of recordings, because you can guess why, because they are fixed and they're predictable. So I prefer the concert always to a recording. It brings in the third dimension, which is the public. And there are three dimensions in giving a concert. There are three aspects. The creator of the music, that's the composer. The recreator, that's the performer. And the receiver, which is you, the public. And you need all three, I think, to make the thing work.
And thinking about the future, are there any works that you really would like to perform or record, or artists you want to work with that you haven't yet done?
I think I've worked with the artists and the orchestras I've always wanted to. I've been very fortunate in that respect. And they do vary a lot, of course. Being a soloist, you don't often do chamber music concerts. Sometimes you do, and sometimes you're surprised for one reason, sometimes for another reason. Sometimes popularity and merit are not necessarily related. Sometimes I work with people who you've never heard of, and they're marvellous. So you really can't necessarily predict according to what the headlines say.
Yes, indeed. Now, if any of you have seen the European Union Chamber Orchestra before, they've visited us, I think, at least the last 2 years in a row. They tend to be directed from the violin. They're stood up. So I wonder, what's the plan this evening with the concerto? Are you taking the lead?
Well, the leader is very dynamic, a young German, and he really knows his stuff, and he's happy to do it. So there'll be a bit of telepathy, I hope, between him and me, but I've got every confidence in him.
And what's the working relationship like with a violinist director instead of a conductor, since they really don't have their hands free to sort of go along with what you're doing?
When you've got a relatively small number of expert players, as today, they're amazingly good at working together without any frantic agitation from any conductor. Just a nod occasionally, a blink of an eye can do the trick. And I've worked with orchestras, and I've also directed from the piano in Mozart concertos, and orchestras are no fools. They play very well, and the conductor is often illusory. not always. But often people think the conductor is all important. Well, you don't often see orchestral players looking that often at conductors. I get on very well with most conductors. There are only a handful of conductors I shall never work with again. And I think 3 of those have passed away. But on the rare occasions you do get somebody and you really admire their musical sense, but you have no agreement with what they're saying. Even though you can admire them for their own point of view, you can't say that's your chemistry. And if I'm doing a piano concerto, I have to have some say in it, obviously, because they've got the conductor, the orchestra have got the overture, and they've got the symphony and other things. But if you're there, people don't come along to hear the conductor's version of a piano concerto.
Yeah.
You know, so in the end, if I get no joy in the rehearsal, I then actually let him get on with it. And in the concert, I come out bloody-minded. And often there's a lot of problem with sweaty conductors during the concert. I mean, sometimes with some conductors, I must say, after I've played a concerto, I'm covered in perspiration, which is theirs rather than mine.
So we don't need any towels for you later then, just in case.
I think with my hairstyle, I can always say I cut my hair off to increase my fee. I can also say it saves on the lighting when I bow. But it also keeps you a bit cooler, so I'm going to pretend it was a deliberate action.
That's it. Do you think you get a different response from the players when there's no conductor, since they really have to listen much more?
They're a bit more focused, yes, they have to be, because it's up to them, really. Of course, there's music where you have to have a conductor. If I'm doing a Brahms concerto, or Rachmaninoff concerto, there's so many speed changes in such a short time, there has to be somebody trying to give some sort of lead.
Yeah.
Whether they do or not is another story. But I often find that those with the biggest egos, you know, the biggest mouths, conductors who are really the sort of bosses and try to be tyrants, very often the empty vessels make the most noise, and very often they're a sign of mediocrity. Sometimes the quieter and the more thoughtful types, reflective types, can give a far more fabulous, I shan't say accompaniment because that's not the right word, collaboration. Yes. Collaboration.
So there's essentially not really getting in the way with their
That's
their
right.
extra, yeah.
In the same way, when I play, I don't like to get in the way of the music. I think music, my responsibility is to approach the original inspiration which governed the composer at the time of composition, not a few years after the composer wrote it, because I think the composer is as far removed then as perhaps a very good performer. I think you have to capture that inspiration at the time when the composer was that really moved by what he was receiving. Because I do strongly believe in receiving these powers, whether you're a composer or anybody or a performer. I think there's so much that we know so little about. There are so many unseen forces of intelligence and profundity and good as well as bad. And it's very important for some people just to realize the simple truth that all that you read about is not necessarily what there is. We read about crime, we read about money, we read about fashion, things which are material and instant. But we don't think about the longer term spiritual things which are so important, which really, of course, they could govern everybody if they gave them a chance to do so. And before I give a concert, I will always have, except for today, of course, because of this chat, I will always have an hour's rest. Because then I empty my mind of the earthbound rubbish that's filled it during the day and make it receptive. And then I realize sometimes, not always, sometimes, that I'm playing better than I otherwise would, because I'm in between two worlds, two states of mind, put it that way, different dimensions. And because it's intangible, you can't talk about it in words, any more than you can talk about the colour blue in words. How do you describe the colour blue? How do you describe music in words? You really can't do it. I think music begins where words stop, but of course I'm very biased.
We'll let you off.
I'm sure you've been asked this many times before, but what really got you interested in music and what keeps you interested now?
I don't know. My parents tell me that I was picking out tunes on a neighbour's piano when I was about 3.5 or 4. It's always been my chemistry. I don't know what started it. I was also keen on drawing and painting. My father was a very good amateur cartoonist. He never made a penny out of it because he wasn't a very good businessman. But I was very keen on that, and I believe I won the Daily Mirror Prize when I was young for painting. But then music took over decisively. But as for the origin, I can't answer, because to me it's always been obvious, the thing to do. And of course, It was in the east side of London, east end of London, just after the Second World War, during the Second World War, when things really were difficult, and financially people were very stretched. But I reckon there was far more opportunity if you had talent in those days than people who have the same talent now.
Now you're on the faculty at Royal College of Music.
I go there when I can. I'm actually on the council and I've done quite a lot of tuition there. I really confine it now to master classes because of my irregular lifestyle.
Yes, in fact I was about to ask what importance you place on teaching.
Well, it's a very difficult subject. You know, you can't put blood into a stone, and sometimes very good teachers are so rated because they know the right people to pick as their students. I think the best thing you can do is to avoid people getting into bad habits. And to point out obvious mistakes, obvious mislearnings and things like that. But when it comes to teaching somebody to do something, okay, you can with many subjects, but I think in music you're relying so much on intangible qualities as well, which are so closely related to your personality. You can't really force somebody to say, that is the way it has to be. And this is the fingering you have to use. If I'm teaching a little girl of 5, the fingering for a piece of music, I could never suggest my own because difference in size of hands. Same thing with pedalling, same thing with tempo. No two people are the same, and they've all got different blood pressures and different feelings. And it's only right that things should be different. Best thing you can do is just to guide them in a benevolent way. Never be unkind to them, never destroy their confidence, but to point out obvious problems. And if you can, teach with regard to some mechanical aspects of regarding technique, then you can. That's safe enough. The main thing is that you keep them optimistic and you keep them interested. I think enthusiasm is very, very important.
I was going to say, I usually like to save this to the end of the discussions, but we always try and have something for the younger musician. So I wonder if you have any advice for those starting out in music.
Everyone thought I'd fail as a musician because they were out kicking balls in the street, and it wasn't quite as bad. Wasn't quite as sport mad as it is nowadays, or pop mad. But of course these things make fast fortunes of money, as we know. But in those days, I was an oddity, and I just thought, right, I'll show you. I'm not going to back down. So I think they must have real enthusiasm and to be a bit bloody minded, you know, to knock away reviews and people's criticisms of what they're doing, but to be honest with themselves, to be their own severest critic. And never to feel they've made it, because there's always something around the corner whereby you go a bit higher up that mountain. That's the beauty of it. That's the joy of it. That's the real punch in the whole game. You never get perfection, but you can approach it, and when you approach it, that gives you a great buzz.
Great, thank you so much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there's an opportunity for you to ask John any questions you may have. I'm sure there are lots and lots going around, and Fran will come around with a little microphone so everyone else can hear what your question is.
I just wondered if you've got any particular affinity with any composer or composers that you particularly feel an affinity with.
That's a very good question, and of course the answer is yes. I do have certain people I regard as super geniuses. That said, you must always give a new work the benefit of the doubt and learn it thoroughly before you play it. But I think it's wrong to play something you don't particularly admire, because then you're deceiving your public as much as the composer. But in short, I can't think of a greater genius than Beethoven, personally speaking. But I have the utmost regard for Bach, Mozart, Brahms, and many of the Russians too, Prokofiev, Rachmaninoff. But I think the super 4 for me would be Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Brahms. And if I had to name one person's music I'd need to take only to a desert island, it would have to be Beethoven. Because I think he showed that it's not so much whether you receive hardship in life, it's the way you react to it that can prematurely develop you. He was to be a great pianist. He became profoundly deaf. Rather than capitulate and give everything away and close the books, he became a supreme master in composition. So I think it's a great lesson for people, whether you receive hardship or even a tragedy, which sounds rather bizarre. You can develop yourself very rapidly by taking the right actions, by your right motives. And I think he did that. It's a great lesson to learn, quite apart from the incredible output of his writing. I mean, it really is, the humour is incredibly funny, and the profundity and the tragedy can be just as opposite. So here you've got a huge range of human utterance, which goes beyond emotion, in my opinion.
That's actually a really interesting point on going deaf with Beethoven in the early 1800s. He went to a place called Heiligenstadt to recover, hopefully, from his hearing, and became very depressed and talked about committing suicide. But it was sort of a double-edged sword here, because he was talking about how God had given him sort of a divine purpose, such with his ability with music. But now he'd sort of taken away his ability to hear. So on that side he wanted to end his life, but on the other side, that music was almost a saviour in a way. So
yes, he wrote that the creative force had communicated to him on numerous occasions during that period, not least through the trees. Interesting.
In passing, you mentioned offering pieces of music for concerts and so on, and you said sometimes they said they didn't want them, and I was rather intrigued by what criteria people might not want something that you offered to play for them.
Well, I'm pleased to say it's not because, I hope it's not because of the way I would play that particular piece. It might be, but it's mostly because they've got the same piece at the same season, or they've had it recently played, the same work. It's as simple as that. But you do get labelled with certain composers, and people often prefer me to play certain types of music, certain types of composition than others, and it's always a personal choice. I'm happy to try to give what they would like, or even a compromise, but in the end, I keep it limited to half a dozen recital programs each year, which I do change, and that should give them plenty of alternative fodder.
Oh, yes.
It's good to see so many smiling faces. I hope you'll be as smiling after the concert tonight.
Apropos your comment about conductors, I remember an interview given by Alfred Brendel when he was somewhat critical of Sir Malcolm Sargent. Of the dead conductors you didn't particularly appreciate, can you name any?
Oh, that would be unfair to them. I mean, we're going through a fashion now of running down dead people, aren't we, with the media? And I don't think it's fair if they can't answer back. The great conductors I've worked with, I've been very, very lucky. People like Barbarolli, Sir Adrian Bolt, Svetlanov, the great Russian conductor, Temyakanov. And in the early days, Bernard Haitink, I was very impressed with him. Very, very lucky to have had this experience for about 5,000 concerts, and very lucky still to be doing so. I'll be approaching my 70th birthday next year, and I'm very, very lucky they still work, and I can find middle C on a good day. So I better not say about the dead ones. Not many, I must say, not many. People always think it's a very serious subject, this business of looking down intently and playing, and of course it is a responsibility, it is serious. But there are lots of funny things that happen as well, you know, things people say to you in particular. I remember doing a BBC broadcast some years ago, and it was a Mozart recital, which was going out live rather than dead. And I knew I'd be fated, because in those days, the third programme, it was then called, was much stricter with time. And I knew I was going to overshoot the 1 o'clock news. But they didn't fade me. I played through the Greenwich Pips, and the newscaster was very, very worried, because instead of having 2 minutes to read his news, he only had 1. So he was in a great hurry when I finished playing, and he very quickly announced my name and what I'd played. In his hurry to get the microphone, he hit it by mistake. Sorry, in his hurry to get the script for the news, he hit the microphone by mistake. And fearing he made a very loud noise, he apologised to the listening public. But the microphone was very well protected, and there was silence. So what came out on the recording they sent me was this: that Mozart recital was given by John Lill. Sorry about that. Well, he may have been my best critic, who knows? Or I remember once playing the Hammerklavier in America, and this lady came round with a sort of a quill through her hat, which went up near the ceiling. She said, "Mr. Pill, I really enjoyed that sweet little piece." Now this is a 50-minute marathon work, and I was dripping like a drain. And then she said, I suppose you've got a piano at home, have you?" So there are many things that you can smile about. Any other questions?
All done? Blimey. Oh, yes. Or
I've got a question I'd like to ask, if I may.
Please.
How do you concentrate on difficult passages in a concerto and keep your eye on a conductor at the same time?
Well, when you're looking at me now, you poor thing, you can still see him, can't you? Because he's near me.
Well, yes, but I'm not paying any attention to him.
But if he were to give a beat, a downbeat, you'd probably be aware of it, you know. You don't actually have to look directly at a conductor. And besides, when you're playing the piano, you don't really look at the keys much. You look above them and your mind is elsewhere. The automatic part of playing from memory and the fingering should be well within your system so that you can climb over it and look beyond. And I think the deepest parts of the concentration, it's rather like driving a car down a narrow lane. It's a very windy lane, but you're protected by the hedges and the trees, which keep you away from them. It's a difficult thing to put into words. The thing you mustn't do when you're dealing with complicated passages is to worry about them. Once you start thinking about, how am I going to get through this, you're finished. You don't do that. I remember arguing when I went to the Tchaikovsky competition in 1970. There was a competitor also in the finals, and he had a fit of nerves on the stage doing Brahms No. 1. And he said, will somebody get me off the stage? It came off. It's all I wanted to do when I was playing from the first note to the end. So then on another day we had a chat about doing repeats. I always feel that if the composer puts in a request for a repeat, it's something you should do. You know, he doesn't put it in to make the score look pretty. And besides, if you're making an omelette, which takes 2 eggs, you don't leave one out because they're both similar, do you? But he said to me, I was taught, John, if you get through it the first time, for God's sake, keep going. But I do hope you enjoy the concert tonight. Normally, I either give a solo concert or I work with a large symphony orchestra. Next week I shall be with the Bournemouth Symphony doing Beethoven No. 1, 3 concerts. It's a real joy to play with an economical number of really distinguished young musicians. Yeah. And it's a very pleasant change. It's like cleaning your teeth. Well, thank you very much indeed for coming along in such number. And again, I hope you enjoy the evening.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Thank you.
Watch out for more events and updates available on our website, www.venuecymru.co.uk.